Do you know, Brigadier, that we orphans, the whole town of us, are dying? So he began his first temptation. I do, the brigadier replied. And do you know whose worthless thievery caused such a thing to happen to us? No, I don't. The first temptation was over. Evsich returned to the belfry and gave a detailed report to the people. The brigadier, seeing such harshness in Evsich, was very frightened, the chronicler tells us. 3 days later, Evsich came to the brigadier a second time, but now he had lost his former firm look. With justice I'll live well anywhere, he said. If my cause is right, you may send me even to the end of the earth. There, too, I'll be well with justice. True, you can live well with justice, the brigadier replied, only here is what I'll tell you. It would be better for you, old man that you are, to sit at home with your justice rather than call down trouble on your head. No, I'm not going to sit at home with justice because our Mother Justice is fidgety. You think of getting home and into a warm bed and she, Mother Justice, is driving you out. That's what. Well, then I'm not against it, only there's a chance that you and your justice are kicking against the pricks. The second temptation was over. Evsich again returned to the belfry and gave another detailed report to the people. And the brigadier, seeing that Evsich needlessly discussed justice, now feared him less than before, adds the chronicler. In other words, Ferdishchenko realized that if a man begins a roundabout talk about justice, it means he is not quite sure he will not be flogged for this same justice. After another 3 days, Evsich came to the brigadier the third time and said, And do you know, old cur, but before he had time to properly open his mouth, the brigadier in his turn barked, Put the fool in fetters. They dressed Evsich in prisoner's garb and led him, like a bride going to meet her bridegroom, to the police station, accompanied by 2 old veterans. As the procession moved on, the crowds of Foolsburgers stepped back, making way for them. Never fear, Evsich, never fear, came from the crowd. You'll live well anywhere with justice. He bowed to all sides, saying, Forgive me, fine boys, if I offended anyone, and if I sinned before anyone, and if I said an unjust word to anyone, forgive me everything. God will forgive, the people responded. And if I was rude to the superiors, and if I was an instigator, forgive me that, for Christ's sake. God will forgive. From that moment on, old Evsich vanished as if he had never existed, vanished without a trace, as only the zealots of the Russian land are able to vanish. Even so, the brigadier's severity was only temporarily effective. For a few days the town grew quieter, but since there was still no bread, no need is more grievous, says the chronicler, willy-nilly the Foolsburgers again had to gather by the belfry. From his porch, the brigadier watched this Foolsburgian rebellious frenzy, thinking, Shoot some now, paff, 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 and that's it for them. But the Foolsburgers were beyond rebelling. They gathered and quietly began to discuss how to provide for themselves, but unable to think up anything new, they again elected a spokesman. The new spokesman, Pakamich, looked at the matter differently than his unfortunate predecessor. He realized that the surest thing now was to begin writing petitions to all places. I know a little fellow, he said to the Foolsburgers. Maybe we should first go and beg for his help. Most of them were happy to hear that. However great their want, they all felt relieved at the thought that there was somewhere a man who was ready to be zealous on their behalf. That they could not do without zeal, they all realized. But to each of them it seemed far more suitable that someone else be zealous for him. Therefore the crowd was just about to move ahead and follow Pakamich's advice when the question arose of where to go, to the right or to the left. Those of the party of restraint took advantage of this moment of indecision. Wait, fine boys, they said. What if the brigadier just thrashes us on account of this man? Let's find out beforehand who the man is. This is a man who knows all the ins and outs, a hard-boiled fellow in short, Pakamich reassured them. On closer look, it turned out that the little fellow was none other than the retired clerk, Bogolepov, dismissed from service for the tremor of his right hand, which tremor was caused by drink. He lived somewhere on the swamp in the dilapidated hut of a town wench nicknamed the nanny goat and a public cup for her frivolity. He had no real occupation and was busy day and night writing pettifogging letters, steadying his right hand with his left. There was no other information about the little fellow, and apparently there was no need for it because the majority were predisposed beforehand to trust him unconditionally. Nevertheless, the question of the restrainers was not wasted. When the crowd finally moved according to Pacamich's directions, several persons separated themselves and went straight to the brigadier's quarters. A schism took place. The so-called fallen away appeared, that is, the far-sighted ones whose task was to preserve their backs from anticipated future commotions. Those fallen away came to the brigadier's premises, yet did not say anything, but just shuffled about there a little so as to witness. However, in spite of the schism, the thing undertaken on the swamp took its course. Bogolepov pondered for a moment as if needing to push the old drunkenness out of his head. But this was a momentary pondering, following which he quickly took a pen out of an inkstand, sucked on it, spat, clutched his right hand with his left, and began to scribble. To all places of the Russian Empire, we, the lowliest and most suffering people of all estates and ranks inhabiting the most unfortunate town of Foolsburg, beg the following points. 1. We hereby inform all places and persons of the Russian Empire. We orphans are dying, all of us to a man. The superiors we see around us are inefficient, strict in exacting taxes, unhurried in providing assistance. And we also inform you, the cabbie's wife, Alinka, who is with that brigadier Ferdishenko, is undoubtedly the source of all our calamities, and we see no other reason. While Alinka lived with her husband Mitka the cabbie, everything was quiet in our town and we lived in plenty. Although we accept to suffer longer, we have an apprehension. If we all die, the brigadier and his Alinka may slander us before the authorities and present us as dubious. Number 2, there are no more points. To this petition, the illiterate people of the town of Foolsburg put 230 crosses by way of signatures. When this petition was read and signed with crosses, everyone felt easier at heart. They put the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and sent it in the mail. See it trudging, the old men said, watching the troika carrying their petition into the unknown distance. Now, fine boys, we won't have to hold out for long. And indeed, the town again became quiet. The Foolsburgers did not think of any new riots, but sat by the gates waiting. When passers-by asked how things were, they answered, "Now our business is assured. We've sent a petition, brother." But a month went by, then another. There was no resolution. The Foolsburgers went on living, went on chewing something. Their hopes were growing and acquired greater probability with every new day. Even the fallen away began to be convinced that their apprehensions were mistaken and insisted on being written down as instigators. Quite possibly this would have ended by wearing everyone out if the brigadier had not stirred up public opinion by his administrative ineptitude. Deceived by the ostensible peacefulness of the townsfolk, he found himself in a most ticklish situation. On the one hand, he sensed that there was nothing he could do. On the other hand, he also sensed that it was impossible to do nothing. Therefore, he undertook something in between, something that partly resembled the game of jackstraws. He would get his hook into the thick of things, fish out a malefactor, and jail him. Then he would do it again, fish out another one, and again jail him. And all the while he wrote and wrote. The first one to be jailed was, of course, Bogolepov, who in his fright denounced a whole lot of malefactors. Each of those in turn denounced a lot of other malefactors. The brigadier luxuriated in it, but the Foolsburgers were not only not frightened, but laughed and said among themselves, "What's this new game the old cur has started?" Wait, they reasoned. The paper's going to come, but the paper would not come, and the brigadier was weaving and weaving his net and gradually weaved it until the whole town was caught in it. Nothing is more dangerous than roots and threads when the authorities get hold of them. With the help of the two veterans, the brigadier fettered and dragged to jail almost the entire town, so that there was no household left without one or two malefactors. This way, brothers, he'll guilt us all, the Foolsburgers figured, and this apprehension was enough to pour more oil into the dying fire. All at once, without any preliminary arrangement, The 150 crosses that had escaped the brigadier's claws turned up on the square. The fallen away again wisely disappeared, and reaching the brigadier's house, they stopped. "Hand over Alinka," the crowd droned. The brigadier realized that matters had gone too far and he had nothing left but to hide in the archive. He did just that. Alinka rushed after him, but as chance would have it, the door of the archive slammed shut the moment the brigadier crossed its threshold. The lock clicked and Alinka remained outside with her arms spread wide. In this pose she was found by the crowd, found pale, her whole body trembling, all but crazed. "Have pity, fine boys, on my fair body," Alinka said in a voice weak with terror. "You know that he took me from my husband by force." But the crowd no longer heard anything. "Tell us, witch," they boomed. "How did you bring drought on our town with your witchcraft?" Alinka was beside herself. She thrashed about and, as if sure of her inevitable end, only repeated, "Wretched me, O Lord, wretched me." Then an unheard-of thing happened. They carried Alinka like a feather to the top tier of the belfry and threw her down onto the rampart from a height of more than 100 feet. And not a shred remained of the brigadier's sweet joy. In the twinkling of an eye, hungry stray dogs tore her up. And just as this senseless, bloody drama was taking place, a thick cloud of dust arose far down the road. "Bread is coming," cried the Foolsburgers, instantly going from fury to joy. "Rooty toot, rooty toot," sounded clearly from within the cloud of dust. "Come running in a column. Bayonets clang. Quick, quick, quick." The Straw Town. The town had barely begun to recover when a new flightiness descended upon the brigadier. He was seduced by the accursed musketeer girl, Domashka. At the time, the musketeers were no longer those Peter Pan musketeers, but they still remembered a thing or two. Their sullen and somewhat sarcastic ways yielded with difficulty to the civilizing efforts of the authorities, however much the latter tried to bring it home to them that ruckus and sedition can in no way be tolerated as a permanent occupation. The musketeers lived in a separate suburban settlement named Musketeers after them, and at the opposite end of town was the Cannoneers suburb, inhabited by Peter's disgraced cannoneers and their descendants. However, common disgrace did not unite these people, and the two suburbs constantly warred with each other. It seemed there were some old accounts between them that they were unable to forget, in which each side formulated thus, quote, "Were it not for your mutual thievery, then we would be enjoying life in Mother Moscow to this day," end of quote. These accounts surfaced particularly during the mowing season. Each suburb owned its special meadows, but the boundaries of these meadows were defined thus, quote, "In the hollow where Long Peter was flogged, there's a wedge of land, and that by two," end of quote. Every year, around St. Peter's Day, both musketeers and cannoneers came to this place. First, they sensibly looked for some gully, some brook, and also some crooked birch tree that had been a very clear boundary sign, but had been cut down 30 years earlier. Then, having found nothing, they would start talking about thievery, and end by gradually applying the scythes. Serious massacres took place, but the Foolsburgers were so used to this phenomenon that they were not in the least embarrassed by it. Later on, the authorities became worried and ordered the scythes taken away. There was no mowing, and the cattle began to die of hunger. Quote, "There was no gain for the musketeers or the cannoneers, but only great glee for the land surveyors," end of quote, adds the chronicler on this occasion. Ferdishenko personally showed up at one of these massacres with a fire pump and a barrel of water. At first he took charge very actively and even sent a big jet of water at the fighters, but when he saw Domashka working in nothing but her shift at the head of everybody, hay fork in her hands, his malignant heart was so inflamed that he instantly forgot both the force of his oath and the purpose of his arrival. Instead of gradually reinforcing the water-pouring tactics, he most calmly sat down on a hammock and, smoking his pipe, struck up a piquant conversation with the surveyors. Thus he sat, devouring Domashka with his eyes, till evening, when the gathering darkness forced the fighting sides to go home. The musketeer girl Domashka was of a completely different kind than Alinka. As much as the latter was smooth and feminine in all her movements, so the former was abrupt, resolute, and masculine. Unwashed, disheveled, bedraggled, she was a typical hellcat, casually cursing and using any occasion to adorn her speech with some obscene gesture. From morning till evening, her voice rang out in the suburb, cursing and invoking all sorts of evil and ceasing only when vodka calmed her to the point of unconsciousness. The young musketeers pursued her with passion, though without hostility among themselves, and generally everybody called her a sugar bowl and an open road. The cannoneers feared her, but secretly lusted after her as well. She was extraordinarily bold. She seemed to accost you directly, as if saying, "Come on, let's see if you can subdue me." And of course it was flattering to prove to this termagant that you could subdue her. She was careless about her dress, as if she felt instinctively that her power was not in colorful seraphins, but in that inexhaustible stream of youthful shamelessness, which broke out irrepressibly in her every movement. Rumor had it that there was a husband, but since she rarely spent nights at home, but slept in barns and sheds, and had no children besides, this husband of hers was completely forgotten, as if she had come into this world as everybody's wench and a barren one besides. But in fact, it was precisely this altogether brazen ignoring of all conventions that attracted the malignant heart of the finicky old man. Alinka's sweet, melting shamelessness was forgotten. He needed a more acute excitement, more capable of affecting his old, somnolent sensuality. "We've tried a sweet wench," he said to himself. "Now let's try a shrewish one." And having said this, he dispatched a police officer to the musketeers' suburb, providing him, for form's sake, with a register. The officer found Damashka drunk, lying behind the kitchen garden by a barn, surrounded by a crowd of young musketeers. Hearing a request to present herself, she was as if astonished, but since in fact she did not care, and to her one horse is as good as another, after a moment's hesitation she started getting up to follow the policeman, but the musketeers protested and took the wench away from him. "That's much too sweet for him," they shouted. "First he takes Alinka away from Mitka, and now he's of a mind to take a woman from our people's communality." The brigadier certainly ought to have been ashamed this time, but he was as if possessed. He ran around town like a madman, shouting and screaming. Of no benefit to him were the lessons of the past, of the remorse of his own conscience, which clearly warned the inflamed old man that it was not he who would have to pay for his sins, but the same totally innocent Foolsburgers. No matter how the musketeer boys protested, no matter how Damashka herself insisted that she dared not go against the people's communality, force got the upper hand as usual. The brigadier had the stubborn wench whipped twice, and twice she quite steadfastly endured the undeserved punishment, but the third time she surrendered. Then the cannoneers stepped forth and started pestering and mocking the musketeers for failing to defend their woman against the brigadier's knouts. "The cannoneers were stupid," explains the chronicler. "They were unable to understand that while laughing at the musketeers, they were laughing at themselves." But the musketeers were beyond explaining the actions of the cannoneers by stupidity or some other reason. Like all mortally insulted people who are unable to take revenge on the direct culprit, they vented their anger on those who reminded them of it. There were fights, outrages, and injuries. They fought one to one and band to band, and it was the town that suffered most of all from the hatred. Being situated exactly in between the warring sides, the brigadier no longer listened to anything or paid attention to anything. He took Damashka up to his quarters and celebrated the first day of his triumph by getting dead drunk together with the new victim of his sensuality. A new and terrible calamity was not slow in befalling the town. The fire began on July 7th, the eve of the feast of the Kazan Mother of God. Until the first days of July, things could not have been better. There were occasional rains, and they were so gentle, warm, timely that everything that could grow grew with extraordinary speed, swelled and ripened as if brought out of the depth of the earth by magic. But then came the heat and the drought, which were also beneficent, because this was the time for the field work. The people rejoiced, hoping for an abundant harvest, and hastened with work. In the morning of the 6th, the holy fool Archipushko came out of the marketplace, stood in the middle, and began to wave his homespun shirt in the wind. I'm burning, the holy fool shouted. The old men who were chatting next to him fell silent, surrounded him, and asked, "Where, dear man?" But the prophet muttered something incoherent. A musket shoots, scorching with fire, stifling with stench and smoke. You'll see the sword of fire, hear the voice of an archangel. I'm burning. They could not get anything else from him, because having uttered this nonsense, the holy fool vanished at once, and as if falling through the earth, and no one ventured to stop the blessed man. Nevertheless, the old man fell to thinking. "You mentioned a musket," they said. nodding in the direction of the musketeers' suburb.